Phyllis
Nagy.
Nagy? Oh, is it true? There are so many ways to mispronounce that name. So,
Yes.
and having a name,
And I enjoy hearing them all.
So I thought it was spelled Nage.
Nagy.
Oh, it is Nagy, right?
It's a Hungarian name.
No, oh, very good. So where are your ancestors from?
Mostly from Sicily.
Is that true?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's one guy from Hungary.
And he brought the name.
And he was gone long before I was born.
Right.
The Sicilian woman dumped him.
But took the name first.
Yeah.
Understood. I did go to the press conference. Was it at the... was it on Central Park? The hotel?
Here in New York?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was at
about
a
a month
hotel
ago. Yeah.
somewhere there.
At the Essex House or something.
That's right.
Was it? Anyway, so I should have noted the pronunciation, but everybody just says Phyllis, so...
Yeah.
And, I should say I wasn't planning on asking a question because I just kind of was there to observe. And maybe I thought, okay, if somehow I run into Todd and he says, who are you? And I'll say, well, I do this podcast because I've been trying to get him on. I was bending Christine's ear about this, too, which I saved to the end, just so I have a little class. Okay. I wasn't trying to, use the opportunity. This time I'm being less classy, obviously, but it came up. But I went to the press conference, is my point, and I thought, all right, I'm going to ask a question. And I asked it of you.
Oh, right.
Remember? Anyway, you may have done one or two press conferences.
God, yes, I have, and they all blur. So forgive me.
But my question was, and maybe it'll start to, synapses might start to pop a little. My question was how in writing the screenplay and adapting the book by Patricia Highsmith, which was originally called The Price of Salt, but then later became Carol. Here's a woman who is risking her motherhood on some level. It's a male question, too, how she still manages to come off very maternal, very loving, very sympathetic. Was that something you were keeping in mind?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of these stories, well, not that there have been that many stories like this to come across cinema screen, but those that have been told are mostly, in the mainstream, are mostly from a male perspective. And I'm talking about on basically on script level as well. And I think that what distinguished Pat's novel and what seemed absolutely key to keep through everything else was the relatively healthy psychological choices that women make in situations like this. Carol knows on some level that she may not be able to articulate that the healthy choice is to temporarily walk away, to get herself in order to be the person that she must be in order to be the person her daughter needs her to be.
And psychologically survive.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the world, right? Because staying may have just sort of sabotaged.
Right. That's a hugely emotional choice. But it isn't a sentimental choice. The sentimental choice is to deny yourself your well-being.
And your authentic...
Your identity.
Right.
Your
authenticity.
Yes. Yeah. And that's a false choice, really, that Carol rejects. She's not sitting at home, I imagine, going through all those steps. But in the end, she is a strong woman who makes the right choice. And because she does so honestly and with a minimum of histrionics, I think this is why people respond to her, don't question the choice. I mean, obviously, there will always be people who question such a choice, what I like to call the subject matter people, who are able to take every bit of narrative impulse out of context and look at them only through the
prism of
their own,
of these conventions
yes,
that
exactly.
we were brought up with, and that but that can be very limiting. I see from the conversation and from my question and how I posed it at the press conference that as progressive-minded as I think I am, I think that I kind of still learned that something about myself, that I still have these impulses, like my son lives with his mother. I mean, he also has a younger sister that I'm just bringing this up as a case example, but I always felt like the son should live with the mother. I don't know, or the child should live with the mother if there's a divorce. Just that's my instinct. But
yeah. But that's the social code. It goes way back, where not to be chastised for reaching into that deep psychological conditioned well. But when someone does make a choice that runs counter to that, it's natural that the questions be asked. I mean, the film, the script, the performance, everything is asking you to ask that question. And hopefully, most people, in asking the question, learn something, well, not so much about themselves, but about an alternate window. It's like opening up another window onto the way that people survive. And if you think about just that, then it's achieved something, I guess.
I was also talking to Christine about the character of Harge, Carol's husband, who they have obviously something of a tumultuous relationship, and how maybe on paper, Patricia's novel, he's a little bit more one-dimensional. That's not meant to criticize. I'm just less. But a better way to say it is less three-dimensional than comes in the movie. And I wonder if kind of making Harge more fuller, what better, more well-rounded a character, more sympathetic ultimately, because he loves Carol and he feels very rejected, and his instincts are very, very from personal woundedness. And with that, we kind of feel more for him at the same time. So we feel like here's a sensitive man. He might be internalizing his sensitivity, but that makes him maybe a loving dad. We see all this stuff, so we're less worried about this child.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, he all of these characters, it goes for all of the men. They too are just behaving the way men behaved at the time, and I dare say there are a fair number of men who still behave that way. But I think the difference between script and novel is that in the novel, of course, we're getting all of this information about Harge and Richard and, to a certain extent, Danny.
Richard is Therese's
boyfriend.
Right?
Danny is her friend, who is also a very different character in the book. But we're seeing this through Therese's unreliable narration, and I mean unreliable in the sense that she only has eyes for Carol. So of course, everybody else is going to come off badly in some way, and it works in the book. Obviously, at least I didn't feel a need to judge these characters, and I think that's key. If you present honest behavior. And don't feel like you're sitting up on a perch, or the opposite, which is to be afraid of making them engage in sometimes what would appear to be harsh or ugly behavior. If you're not afraid of either one of those things, I think audiences can generally empathize with a character. Also, those actors, I mean, particularly we're talking about Harge, as played by Kyle Chandler, also made choices that were not judgmental and not sentimental, but deeply felt. So all of these characters are operating through love.
Yeah.
What love does or engenders in them. And sometimes it's extremely painful, as it is in the case of Harge's love for Carol, which seems everlasting in a funny way. Richard, Therese's boyfriend, I don't think he really knows what love is, but whatever it is, he feels it in whatever stage he's at. He feels it for Therese.
Right, and he's calling it love.
Yeah. And the net result of being rejected in his case is, I must say, an understandable anger. Not only is he rejected, but he's rejected for a woman, which, must have been very strange to him, given his social circle.
Right. But he seems also to be not necessarily nonplussed, because I think they're both Harge and Richard are both very hurt and bewildered on some level by the choices that the women in their lives are making, But on the other hand, they're also not as judgmental as I expected them to be. They're not really being harsh on them in terms of being lesbians. Maybe they just don't have the vernacular for it.
They don't have the vocabulary. But beyond that, I think it's a common sense thing.
Uh-huh.
When you're creating a character, there was something about these men that both of these women responded to. And maybe it's that innate lack of judgment of the time.
Right. True.
And so for me, that was just a common sense meat and potato character choice that makes a great deal of sense. It's not something that you necessarily see bleeding out on the page because people don't talk about things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm such a great guy. I understand you. I took you back when you went off with Abby, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there's something about them that's inherently decent. And that didn't have to be the case.
That's a good way of putting it. I know you had a friendship with Patricia Highsmith. You knew her personally. I'm vaguely remembering some of your anecdotes where she was not in favor of actually adapting any of her books, or was it this particular one?
Yeah, no, she didn't like any of the film adaptations.
Oh, that's what it was.
Saw
like
of her
Purple
books.
Noon.
None of them.
I'm trying to think what
Strangers on a Train.
Strangers on a Train, and I guess
The American Friend. And there were lots of
and they're all so
European-
fantastic. That's the beauty of it, or the funny part. I
know.
I love all three of those.
But I understand that from her perspective,
Yeah.
especially the Hitchcock, really betrayed the original intention of her book, however fantastic a film it is.
Well, you do the best you can under the
Yeah.
circumstances and the times.
I don't know what she would have made of this. It is interesting, as you were talking about Harge and Richard, to note that immediately after writing this novel, she wrote The Talented Mr. Ripley, which features another prominent Richard in, and Richard is a name that she uses a lot throughout her work. And they're usually these hapless, somewhat callow golden boys.
So portrayed by Philip Seymour Hoffman. Was that Richard, or who was the Richard in that?
Richard
I
was
don't remember.
Jude Law.
Jude Law's character.
Dickie.
Of course,
Greenleaf. Yeah.
What a great name.
Yeah. But it's interesting that she reserved a particular place in her dark heart for men named Richard.
Oh no, I have to start reading, going back, I guess, and reading, so I can maybe uncover this mystery. So, explain for those who don't know, which is probably most people, the circumstances of your relationship with Highsmith.
Well, I was a researcher, a fact checker for New York Times Part 2 magazines in the late 80s when I was a kid. Well, at the time, they were magazines like The Sophisticated Traveler or The World of New York, or there was a lot of them. I can't remember.
They were in the magazine, only it was devoted to a particular
subject.
To carry ads.
Yeah, that's right.
A vehicle for advertisements.
I don't know if they have those kinds of things anymore.
I think they do.
Yeah,
I think so.
Anyway, the editor of World of New York wanted to hire a mystery writer to do a walking tour of Greenwood Cemetery, in which there are some prominent people buried and a lot of gangsters and gun malls.
This is in Brooklyn?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The Steinways are buried there, and there's that great piano mausoleum, and it's quite a place.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Anyway, so I can't remember who they asked or they wanted to get to write this, but I think it was Ruth Rendell, and she wasn't here. She wasn't available. And I suggested Pat Highsmith. And who knew that she was in town here in New York at that very moment doing a book tour for a novel called Found in the Street, which is a rather good late Pat Highsmith novel that's set in Greenwich Village.
Oh.
Anyway, she said yes, much to everyone's surprise, and so they sent me as a punishment, I guess, or a reward to accompany her. I didn't know that she had such a strange and prickly reputation as a person when I went to meet her, but I quickly discovered that she was extraordinarily reticent and a little bit ominous. We took this tour of this cemetery together. She said almost nothing, but she got very excited when she came across the grave of Lola Montez and sort of grunted a few times and took her walking stick and hit the grave.
How old would she have been in the 80s?
In the mid-60s, her mid-60s.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Which was actually felt older than it does now and by our standards.
Yeah.
Because of people living longer.
And then we had to take this awful tour of the crematorium and put our hands in the ovens, and it was awful. Anyway, when we were finished with this tour, it was about 11 a.m. And outside the cemetery, she just took out a hip flask of something, and she said, "I don't know about you, but I need a drink." And she held it out to me like some kind of challenge.
Right. This was the test.
Yeah. So I took it was scotch, as it turned out. And she invited me to lunch, which turned out to be 6 packs of cheap beer. And from then on, we were really very great friends. At first, great correspondents, because still in those days, there was no email. So you wrote letters. She was a great letter writer. Once a week, there'd be this exchange of letters. And then...
where did she live?
She lived, by this time, she was living in Switzerland, and she was about to build and design her last, what became her last house. But I moved to London in 1992, and so we saw each other a lot more then. And she died in early 95.
So, okay. I guess a protege of sorts.
Sorts,
but it became friends.
Yeah.
It balanced out.
I mean, she wasn't a
Right.
She wasn't a dramatist, and she was just she was very generous to people that she thought were smart.
Right.
If there was a young woman, I don't think she had any relationships at this point in her life, but if you were a young woman she didn't think was particularly smart, then she could become the sort of Henry Higgins. Let me take you under my wing, sweetheart.
Yeah.
Sort of person.
And I'm not suggesting for a moment that you were in a relationship with her, because your relationship was a friendship as you already described it, but did you see any parallels at all between your relationship with Pat's, I calling her Pat like I know her, like she's a friend of mine, and Therese and Carol's, in terms of a dynamic? Like, in other words, there is a balancing ultimately.
Well, yeah. No, because by that time, Pat was elderly, and there was not... There's always a sexual frisson between Therese and Carol, even when Therese can't properly identify it. And in this case, it was more... I loved her work, or at least the work I had read until that point. And so if there was any parallel, it was Pat guiding me to the books that she thought I should read and love of her work, which wasn't, notably, The Price of Salt, or Carol, as it was called by then. I don't think she rated it as one of her finest pieces of work. Now, whether that was because it was so intensely personal a book for her and she had to distance herself from it, or whether she really felt like she knocked this off in a fever dream and that was that, I don't know. But I do know that she did not want to really discuss it in depth. And so I didn't read it until after she died. And it's interesting. I wish more people would read it. Not because I don't think I myself would put it within her best 3 or 4 books. But I don't think I would have done it, this adaptation, if I felt it was like Deepwater, which I think is her great, great novel. Carol left lots of room.
Oh, I see what you mean. Also, sometimes flawed works are, they mean something different. They're just and I don't. I mean, that's the problem with one of the problems, I think, in the way a lot of culture or society views art, making and art, is that we don't take into account the broader context of a career of work,
That's
a
right.
body of work, an oeuvre, whatever. I look at failures as being important. When I see a film, I maybe seen the 6 or 7 films, I'm much more forgiving because I'm looking at the context.
Exactly. And also, I wish more people would read. What I'm learning over these months, being out on the road with this, is that not a lot of people who have reviewed it or talked about the film in a significant way have read the book. Mm-hmm. I think there's an assumption that it's just a very faithful adaptation of this simple love story, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. The film is a profoundly faithful, in tone and intent, adaptation of this book. I hope Pat would have liked it. I know she would have loved Cate Blanchett in a particular way.
Yeah.
It was her type, and she would have loved Rooney Mara. Beyond that, I don't know, but certainly it's a very different piece of work than the novel, and I wish people would read it. I mean, we don't have the advantage of it being a recent bestseller or a graphic novel or any of the things that people tend to read.
Yeah, I came very close in trying to squeeze it in between seeing the movie and no, I know that this wasn't aimed at me. She made a facial gesture for those who wondering what letting me off the hook type of experience. But actually, no, I was, because of the way I approach this kind of stuff that I do. I actually, wouldn't be outside the frame. I can't read everything, but I would have read it. I'm very curious to read it. It's just that I need more distance in a way, just so I can approach it and really, enjoy it, like without keeping all those faces. And, I saw the movie so recently, Carol, relatively, but I'm very curious to start reading her. And there's so many adaptations now, and most of them actually succeed on some level. That I haven't seen any really bad adaptations, though I understand Patricia Highsmith may have disagreed. I mean, there may be a couple out there I'm forgetting.
There are a lot of strange European television adaptations.
That's right. There was something with Malkovich that was kind of
Well, that was an attempt at one of the Ripley novels. I can't remember.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen the latest. There was one last year, wasn't there? Tremor of Forgery.
I don't remember the title. That's an odd thing.
That's a very good book. Mm-hmm. So I'm keen on finally watching that one. Mm-hmm. But I get it. I mean, Strangers on a Train, those two men do trade murders in Pat's book.
Right.
So Hitchcock made of it a moral statement, which was the last thing that Pat was interested in. So that's why she would have hated that film.
I see.
I think if she put a few drinks in her, she would have admitted that it was quite a thrilling film all by itself.
Well, again, the hip flask.
Yeah, exactly.
She should bring it into the movie theaters when she's seeing an adaptation of her own novels. I should have asked this at the very top because now I'm curious. You said, obviously, you did some fact-checking, et cetera, for the New York Times. So where'd you grow up?
New York.
You're New York?
I grew up in the East, what's now called the East Village, but was then the Lower East Side, St. Mark's Place.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. So you grew up in Manhattan in your formative years and everything?
I did, yeah.
Very good. Oh, yeah. Okay. Interesting.
I mean, not that I would have, it might as well have been Iowa.
Right.
Because I was confined to a 2 or 3 block radius.
I see. Interesting.
School, church, home.
Oh, yeah. Right. Oh, you mentioned, yes, and there is a bit of Eastern European. There's a lot of Polish in the East Village, right? And
I guess, and back then there was in the 70s there was more. There were more.
Much more.
Ukrainian, Polish. Ukrainian. I went to the Polish Catholic school down the road. Yeah.
And now, where do you live now?
Now I live in Los Angeles.
Okay.
Ridiculous place.
No judgment here. Well, thank you, Phyllis. It's delightful meeting you, and it was really nice talking to you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
My pleasure.